I never thought a job as a cave guide would be anything more than a way to combine my love for nature with making a living. The cave itself was breathtaking, stalactites shimmering like chandeliers, an underground lake so clear you'd think it was glass, and tunnels that seemed to twist into infinity. Tourists came and went, each wide-eyed with wonder, but it was the silence that always got to me. When the last lantern flickered out, the kind of quiet that settled over the place felt unnatural. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful, like the cave itself was listening. On this particular day, I was leading a smaller group. It felt like any other tour at first. We had a couple of adventurous college kids, an older couple snapping endless photos, and a geologist named Mark. Mark stood out. He wasn't there for the usual sights. His eyes kept scanning the walls like he was searching for something hidden. He'd asked me earlier about sections of the cave that weren't on the main tour, which made me uneasy. Those parts weren't meant for casual explorers, and frankly, I didn't like thinking about what might be down there. We reached the echo chamber, a wide, cavernous room where every sound seemed to bounce back tenfold. Most tourists loved it, yelling or clapping to hear their own echoes play tricks on their ears. But I never liked that place. The echoes weren't just loud, they were off. Sometimes, it felt like they carried a delay or a strange tone that didn't belong to the original sound. I shrugged it off as part of the cave's weird acoustics, but deep down, it always made me uneasy. That day, one of the college kids pointed out something strange. He claimed he heard a low, distant hum coming from one of the side passages, a part of the cave that had been sealed off for years. I tried to brush it off, telling them it was just the way sound carried in these chambers. But Mark's eyes lit up. He insisted we check it out, mumbling something about new geological formations. Against my better judgment, I agreed to take a quick look. It was a decision I'd regret forever. As we moved deeper into the side passage, the air felt different. Thicker. Every breath was like inhaling damp wool. The hum grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a constant sound. It pulsed like a distant heartbeat. Our lanterns cast long, twitching shadows on the walls, but the darkness felt heavier here, almost tangible. I noticed the light didn't stretch as far as it should have, as if the shadows were devouring it. My gut told me to turn back, but Mark was already ahead, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. We emerged into a massive chamber, larger than any I'd seen before. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. They weren't like anything I'd seen during my years as a guide, no familiar patterns or historical markings. Mark ran his fingers over them, whispering to himself. In the center of the chamber was a natural well, a gaping hole in the earth that seemed to suck in the light. One of the college kids tossed a rock into it. We waited for the sound of it hitting the bottom, but it never came. Instead, the echo returned, distorted and wrong. It sounded like the rock had hit something, alive. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I've been in enough caves to know what echoes sound like, and that wasn't it. The distorted noise echoed back like a groan, low and guttural. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. Mark, on the other hand, looked thrilled. He mumbled something about undiscovered chambers and ancient structures, his eyes wide with an almost manic excitement. I wanted to tell him to shut up, that we needed to leave, but before I could, one of the students, Jason, decided to get closer to the well. Be careful, I warned, but my voice barely echoed back. He crouched near the edge, shining his flashlight into the void. It's breathing, he whispered, his voice shaking. Before I could process what he meant, a sound, a deep, guttural rasp, came from the well. It wasn't an echo. Jason stumbled back, wide-eyed, but before he could stand up, something shifted. The ground beneath us vibrated, and a shadow darker than the surrounding blackness seemed to spill out of the hole. Everything happened in a blur. Jason scrambled back, tripping over his own feet, while the older couple clung to each other, their faces pale. Mark, though, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the void like he was in a trance. The shadow, it wasn't just darkness. It moved, stretching and shifting like it was alive, spreading across the floor in tendrils. I felt it too, a cold that seemed to seep straight into my bones. Then we heard it, a scream. It came from the passage we had just walked through. One of the college girls, Sarah, took off running toward it, yelling the name of her friend who'd wandered off earlier. I wanted to call her back, but my voice wouldn't come out. The shadows seemed to swallow sound now too. She disappeared into the passage, and a moment later, the scream cut off. Silence. That awful, heavy silence, thicker than before. I turned to Mark, but he was still staring at the well, muttering something I couldn't make out. I grabbed Mark's arm, trying to pull him back, but he didn't even flinch. His eyes were locked on the well, his lips moving in a whisper. I leaned in closer to hear him, and what I caught made my skin crawl. He was repeating the symbols on the walls, chanting them like a prayer. "Mark, snap out of it!" I shouted, shaking him hard. Finally he blinked, his eyes focusing on me for just a second. "It's calling," he muttered. We woke it up. Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled, a low rumble vibrating through the chamber. The symbols on the walls, they started to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, like veins of molten rock. The air grew thick with an electric charge, and that sound, the pulsing rhythmic hum, was deafening now. It wasn't just sound, I could feel it in my chest, in my skull. Then, out of nowhere, Jason screamed. We spun around, but he was gone. Vanished. The spot where he'd stood was empty, nothing but shadows curling over the stone. Panic set in. The older couple clung to each other, their eyes darting around the chamber, desperate for a way out. I scanned the room, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and stretching in ways that didn't make sense. It felt like the whole cave was alive, breathing around us. "We need to go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but the words felt thin, swallowed by the hum. Mark wasn't listening. He stepped closer to the well, his eyes fixed on the glowing symbols. "It's ancient. We're not supposed to be here," he murmured, almost to himself. Before I could stop him, he reached out and touched one of the symbols. The glow intensified, spreading up his arm like fire. He didn't scream. He just stared at me, his eyes wide and empty, before collapsing to the ground. The symbols faded, but the humming grew louder, vibrating through the stone beneath our feet. I couldn't breathe. Mark lay there, eyes open but unseeing, his body unnaturally still. The older couple started backing away from the well, whispering prayers under their breath. I wanted to run, to get out of that chamber, but it felt like the shadows were pressing in, closing off every exit. The hum had changed. It wasn't just noise anymore. There were voices in it, whispers layered on top of each other, too low to understand but filled with a terrible urgency. Then, from the passage we'd come through, something moved. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, I saw it. A figure stumbling forward. My heart jumped. It was Sarah. But something was wrong. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet with half its strings cut. Her eyes, they weren't her eyes anymore. They were black, empty voids that reflected the dim glow of the symbols. She opened her mouth, but the sound that came out wasn't hers. It was a deep, guttural echo, the same sound that had come from the well. Sarah's twisted form staggered closer, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. The older couple screamed and backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber felt smaller, the walls closing in. I grabbed the woman's arm, trying to pull her toward the passage, but as we moved, the ground trembled again, stronger this time. Dust fell from the ceiling, and I could feel the vibrations in my bones. That hum had turned into a roar, the voices growing louder, like a chorus of something ancient and hungry. Then Sarah, or whatever was wearing her face, lunged. It wasn't human anymore, not really. She or it moved too fast, grabbing the older man and dragging him toward the well. His screams echoed through the chamber, but no one came to help. The woman collapsed to her knees, sobbing, and I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I wanted to move, to fight, but my body wouldn't listen. All I could do was watch as the shadows around the well seemed to reach up, pulling the man into the darkness. The woman's sobs turned into a desperate wail, but there was nothing I could do. I grabbed her hand and tried to pull her away, but she was locked in place, staring at the well. I could feel the ground shaking beneath us, a deep, rhythmic thrum that felt like it was coming from the earth itself. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something else, something metallic, like blood. Suddenly, the symbols on the walls flared to life again, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. I saw something in the corner of my eye, a figure, tall and twisted, just beyond the reach of the light. It disappeared when I turned to look, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. The woman was still crying, whispering something over and over. I leaned closer to hear her. "It knows we're here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's hungry." Her words sent a chill through me, deeper than the cold air of the cave. I glanced back at the well, and for a moment, I swore I saw something move within the darkness, a ripple, like the surface of black water. The hum had shifted again, now almost a chant, each pulse vibrating through my chest. The woman was still murmuring, but her voice had changed, almost blending with the droning sound. I tried to pull her up, to get her moving, but she jerked away, her eyes wide and distant. "It's too late," she whispered, staring past me. We woke it up. The ground trembled harder, and I knew we had to leave. I grabbed her again, this time forcing her to her feet. We stumbled toward the passage, but the shadows seemed thicker, more solid, like they were trying to keep us there. My flashlight flickered, the beam barely piercing the dark now. Behind us, that roar grew louder, almost deafening. I didn't dare look back. We had to keep moving to find a way out. But then I heard it, a low, wet dragging sound coming from the passage ahead. Something was waiting for us. I froze, every instinct in my body screaming to turn around and run. But there was nowhere to go. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. In the flickering light of my flashlight, I saw it, a shape emerging from the shadows. It was human, or at least it had been. The form was twisted, limbs too long, skin stretched too tight. Its eyes were empty voids, just like Sarah's, reflecting the faint glow of the symbols. It moved in jerks, a grotesque mimicry of walking, its head tilting in a way that made my stomach turn. The woman beside me let out a strangled gasp and clung to my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to go back," she whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't know where to go. The well behind us, the creature ahead, it was like the cave itself was trapping us. Then the creature's head snapped toward us, and it let out a sound, a low, rattling hiss that vibrated in my chest. It started moving faster, its twisted limbs carrying it toward us with an unnatural, bone-cracking gait. We ran, back toward the well, even though every step took us closer to that pulsing darkness. We stumbled back into the chamber, the ground vibrating beneath us. The hum had become a deafening roar, almost drowning out the woman's sobs. I glanced at the well, its shadowy depths seeming to expand, tendrils of darkness curling over the edge. There was no way out, just that thing behind us and the abyss ahead. I turned, my flashlight shaking, catching glimpses of the creature as it closed in. Its limbs moved like they were disjointed, its head twitching with every step. Suddenly, the woman broke free of my grip. She staggered toward the well, her eyes wide, her face twisted in terror and something else, resignation. "It wants something," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar. "A sacrifice." Before I could stop her, she stepped to the edge, staring into the void. I lunged to grab her, but it was too late. She fell, her scream swallowed by the shadows. For a moment, the hum faltered, like the cave itself had taken a breath. Then the ground trembled harder, and a deep, guttural sound erupted from the well, a sound of satisfaction. I stood there, breathless, the woman's scream still ringing in my ears. The chamber fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant, rhythmic pulsing from the well. I couldn't process what had just happened. The shadows seemed to settle, the glow of the symbols fading slightly, as if the cave itself had been fed. I turned back toward the passage, but the creature was gone. Only the faint sound of something dragging echoed in the distance. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then the hum started again, louder, more urgent. The symbols on the walls flared back to life, brighter than before, casting long, writhing shadows that seemed to move on their own. I felt something behind me, a presence, pressing down like the weight of the earth itself. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I looked back at the well. The darkness was rising, spilling over the edge, twisting into shapes that made no sense, human forms, but wrong, incomplete. They started moving toward me, their empty eyes fixed on mine. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. The figures moved slowly, deliberately, their twisted forms shifting in and out of the shadows. Their eyes, those hollow black voids, were fixed on me, filled with a hunger that I couldn't understand. Every step they took seemed to drain the light from the chamber, the darkness closing in like a living thing. I turned and ran, my breath ragged, the passage ahead barely visible in the flickering beam of my flashlight. The ground shook harder now, the hum becoming a roar that filled my head, making it hard to think. I didn't know where I was going. Everything looked different, the passages twisting in ways I didn't remember. I could hear footsteps behind me, that dragging sound, getting closer. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on me with each step. Then I saw it, a faint light up ahead. An exit? Hope flared in my chest, and I pushed forward, every muscle screaming. But as I got closer, I realized the light wasn't from outside. It was coming from the walls, those same symbols, glowing brighter, pulsing with each step I took. The light from the symbols grew so intense it hurt my eyes, their glow now pulsating in sync with that deafening hum. I stumbled, barely able to keep my footing as the ground trembled beneath me. The passage twisted, the walls seeming to close in, and I realized I was being led back to the well. I tried to fight it, to turn around, but every path seemed to loop back to that cursed chamber. The cave was alive, guiding me deeper into its heart. As I stepped back into the chamber, the figures were waiting. They stood around the well, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their bodies swaying slightly, almost rhythmically. The shadows around them seemed to stretch and twist, as though they were part of the darkness itself. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my bones, until it was all I could hear. I felt something pulling at me, an invisible force drawing me toward the well. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud, but I couldn't stop moving. I was being pulled in, and deep down I knew there was nothing I could do. I was only a few steps from the well now, the force pulling me stronger with each breath. My mind was screaming, but my body wouldn't listen. Those figures, they stood like sentinels, silent and still, their empty eyes fixed on me. I felt like I was being judged, weighed, and found wanting. The hum had become a chorus of voices, layered and ancient, speaking words I couldn't understand. But I felt their meaning deep inside, something beyond human comprehension, something vast and hungry. I reached the edge of the well and looked down. The darkness wasn't just absence of light, it was alive, swirling, and endless. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't mine anymore. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a silent scream. The ground beneath me trembled one last time, and I felt the pull intensify. Just as I started to tip forward, a sharp sound cut through the roar. A voice, distant and desperate. "Run!" It was a whisper, but it broke through the haze in my mind. My legs moved on their own, and I stumbled backward, falling to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, my body shaking. The figures around the well didn't move, but their heads turned slowly to follow me, those hollow eyes locking onto mine. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, the pulsing hum intensifying. I didn't think, I just ran. My legs felt like lead, the air thick, but I pushed forward, every step feeling like a fight against the cave itself. The passage twisted and blurred around me, the shadows stretching and shifting, but I didn't stop. The hum followed me, vibrating in my bones, growing louder until it was all I could hear. I didn't know how long I ran. Time felt twisted, stretched out. But then ahead I saw a light, faint, flickering, but real. The exit. I stumbled toward it, the roar of the cave reaching a crescendo. Just as I broke through the entrance, collapsing onto the rocky ground outside, the noise stopped. Silence. I lay there, gasping for air, the cold night air sharp in my lungs. When I looked back, the entrance to the cave was just there. Quiet. Normal. But I knew it wasn't over. I sat there on the cold ground, staring into the cave's dark mouth, expecting something, or someone, to follow me out. But nothing came. The silence was almost worse than the noise. The night air felt unreal, too quiet, too still. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. It felt like a nightmare, but the raw scrapes on my hands and the ache in my legs told me it wasn't. I was alive. Barely. The other tourists. Mark, the couple, Sarah, their faces flashed in my mind. I knew I couldn't go back for them. They were gone, consumed by whatever ancient thing lay deep in that cave. The memory of those symbols, glowing and pulsing, etched into the stone, and into my mind, wouldn't leave me. I heard the hum again, faint and distant, as if the cave was whispering my name, calling me back. I forced myself to stand, stumbling away from the entrance, each step feeling heavier than the last. I made it back to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. Every shadow around me felt like it was watching, waiting. The hum wasn't just in the cave anymore. It was in my head, a low, insistent pulse that wouldn't stop. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see those hollow eyes staring back at me. The drive back to town was a blur. When I finally reached home, everything felt off. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the well, the symbols, the figures. Their empty eyes burned into my mind. The hum was louder in the quiet of my room, a constant reminder that I'd left something behind, or maybe brought something back with me. Days passed, but the feeling didn't go away. It got worse. Every shadow in my apartment seemed deeper, like something was hiding just out of sight. I stopped sleeping. The hum never left my ears, growing louder in the quiet. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes, flickering and shifting. They were always gone when I turned to look, but I knew they were there. watching, waiting. Then the dream started. I'd find myself back in the cave, standing at the edge of the well. The symbols on the walls glowed, and the figures surrounded me, their empty eyes fixed on mine. They whispered things I couldn't understand, but I felt their meaning deep inside. Each night, the dreams got worse, more vivid. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the hum still in my head. And then one morning, I found something on my doorstep, a map. Hand-drawn, detailed. It showed another entrance to the cave, with a single phrase scrawled across the bottom. "It's not over." I stared at the map, my hands trembling. The paper felt old, almost ancient, the ink smudged and faded. I didn't want to believe it was real, but deep down, I knew it was. I could feel it. The cave was calling me back. That hum, that low, insistent pulse in my head, seemed to grow louder, more urgent, like a heartbeat. I thought about throwing the map away, burning it, anything to get rid of it, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was in that cave, it had already found me. Over the next few days, I tried to go on with my life, but everything felt wrong. The shadows in my apartment were darker, the silence heavier. I kept seeing things, flickers of movement, shapes in the corners of my eyes. At night, the dreams grew worse. The symbols burned in my mind, their meaning just out of reach, but I felt them drawing me back. I knew I couldn't escape it. The cave had left its mark on me. It was only a matter of time. I couldn't take it anymore. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in, the hum in my head louder than ever. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Every noise made me jump. I knew I had to go back. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't have a choice. The cave was calling me, pulling me in like gravity. It felt inevitable, like the end of a story I hadn't finished writing. I packed a bag with the bare essentials and followed the map. The route was different this time, leading me deep into the forest to an entrance I'd never seen before, hidden, almost forgotten. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the hum, it was deafening now. As I stepped inside, the darkness swallowed me, thicker and more oppressive than I remembered. My flashlight barely cut through it. The symbols on the walls were waiting, glowing faintly, pulsing in time with that awful hum. I moved deeper into the cave, each step heavier than the last. The hum vibrated through the stone, through my bones. The symbols on the walls seemed to guide me, their faint glow lighting the way. It wasn't the same path as before, but I didn't need a map, I knew where I was going. The air grew colder, thicker. My breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of the cave pressing down on me. It felt like I was being watched, the shadows shifting just out of reach. I reached the chamber, the well waiting for me at its center. The figures were already there, standing in a circle, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They hadn't moved, but I could feel them watching, waiting. The hum reached a crescendo, the ground vibrating beneath my feet. I approached the well, drawn to it, the pull stronger than before. I looked down, and the darkness stared back, alive, hungry. The whispers returned, layered voices speaking words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my soul. "It's not over," I whispered, the realization sinking in. It never would be. I took a step back from the well, my mind racing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chorus of madness. My flashlight flickered, the beam barely cutting through the thick darkness. Then, the shadows began to move. The figures around the well stepped forward, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like they were waiting for something. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air was thick, pressing down on me, filling my lungs with every breath. Suddenly, the hum stopped. Silence crashed down, heavier than any sound. The figures froze. For a moment, everything felt suspended, like the cave was holding its breath. Then, from deep within the well, a sound, a low, wet rasp, cut through the silence. The shadows around me grew darker, deeper. The figures' hollow eyes seemed to sink into their faces, their forms blending into the darkness. I realized too late that I was never meant to leave the first time. I was just another part of whatever had awakened. I felt the pull again, stronger this time, an invisible force dragging me closer to the well. My feet slid forward, the stone cold beneath me. The whispers grew louder, each word like a needle in my brain. My flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the ground, its light fading as it rolled away. I was alone in the dark now, the only light coming from the faint glow of the symbols, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. As I reached the edge of the well, I looked down one last time. The darkness inside it was absolute, swirling, alive. I knew there was no escape. This wasn't just a cave. It was something ancient, something beyond understanding. I felt the ground shift beneath me, the pull becoming irresistible. The last thing I saw before I fell was my own reflection in the darkness, eyes hollow, mouth open in a silent scream. Then, everything went black.